Hey guys, this is Patrik Sättermo. You might know me as the guy with the most IEM medals in the world, or something like that. I'm also the CGO of FNATIC, and you're watching Duncan Thorin Shields YouTube channel. Pleasure being here.
Right, I'm here for another episode of Reflections. This one is going to be with cArn, who obviously, I actually think it might have been when it was that old series called Grilled that I did with you. I don't know if I actually did like officially Reflections, although obviously me and you know this, unlike the fans. We actually did technically record one a few years ago, and even though usually, you know, even if something's like been on the shelf for years, I'll still release it. This was one of those ones where, because I asked you like a bunch of questions that were related to your roles, the CGO and FNATIC and kind of like day-to-day operations. Actually, some of it had sort of like, it wouldn't have been as interesting for like for example, a whole section was about like Exist joining FNATIC, and obviously he doesn't even play FNATIC anymore for years now, and most people probably don't care about that topic anymore. So what we'll do is we'll redo it basically, and I'll take a different approach, right? So all I want to do at the start is this. I want to actually ask some questions about your playing career first before we get into some of the post-playing career stuff, which is obviously the last 10 years or so, which this is my question, right, cArn? One thing I've always not actually had a great grasp on, because I was obviously never a pro player, and if you look at the way I do my work, I'm a bit of a lone wolf, you know. I don't really like to sort of work in teams as much or with other people, because I'll just be straight up, mate. I get really triggered if they sort of let me down. Like if I was doing Flashpoint stuff, I was just screaming at people without, like, you know, some of the incompetence on stuff, you know. So I prefer to sort of do it myself. So as a result, one thing I'm not a super expert, but it's taken me a long time to actually study in sports, esports, to learn about is leadership, like the quality, like what represents it, what makes it up, you know. And what I realised is that people who have never looked into this have a lot of naive ideas. Like they think, for example, that if you're just the best player or whatever, maybe you should be the leader, or that you can just randomly pick to be the leader. Anyone can be the leader. Like you see in certain teams, some teams even imply like we don't have a leader, you know, we just do it democratically. So one thing I thought when I look back on your career is, at the time, I only used to look at Counter-Strike literally in the server basically. So when we talk about leaders, I just basically was looking, I would reframe it now as I was just talking about tacticians. Like when I say Ave was the best in-game leader, really I just mean he was the best tactician, and so for me that meant best leader at the time. But I actually think your career is an example of one where, I mean, in the server, sometimes the tactics were quite simple. They were just whatever would work with the players you had. But wouldn't you say one of your strengths is leadership? Seems like you were, like, I know in sports they normally say it's like man management. It's like the style of how you like manage egos, how you like get people on the same page, how you motivate them. Wouldn't you say these are strengths of cArn's as a leader?
Find it quite difficult actually to speak about oneself's abilities. I think in the past you would probably have labeled me as someone like, I think you used the terminology like propaganda minister. I was probably quite full of myself. I was, in an inverted way, I guess it worked in the sense that you were very, you didn't have the confidence, you hadn't grown up as a man yet, you were lost in life broadly speaking. But I guess I kind of landed at a place more around not being overly convinced and full of oneself, and realize, let the work do the talking. And with that being said, such questions should probably be answered by other people in your surrounding, being former teammates or colleagues of more recent time. But if I still, in the context of it's only you and myself sitting here, and I'm still a reflective human being. And I think, by the way, this might be our second reflection, because I think I did one with you, the DreamHack after myself retiring, so probably back in 2012 summer or something like that. But right, doesn't matter. Sure. So it's probably like a 360p pixelated shit sitting in the DreamHack upstairs, as you probably remember. And
yes,
wonder if I'm fond of those memories back then. But anyway, so I can still speak, I guess, and with that touching the question, which is directed to myself, just broadly speaking about leadership.
Yeah, like what are your thoughts on what leadership is?
And what I respect in leaders.
Exactly.
So I think like being good at adapting and making people around you better is probably the kind of closest I can come to kind of try to describe myself. I think there has been historically, but obviously no one today really gives a shit about it unless you really remember and cared really deeply around CS 1.6 back then, and the rivalries and the ways of playing the games and the map pools and the tricks and the bunny hops and the Russian jumps or whatever have you. That yes, there was eras where it was very much kind of click headshots and facilitating a f0rest or a get right to do what they had to do to win us the rounds. That's another subject, I think, but I think Counter-Strike is a complex yet a simple game, no pun intended. But reducing to a 5 versus 4 or even a 4 versus 4 when you attack it, for example, then it's just about leveraging the kind of the opening you got in the game. But anyway, separate topic. We can talk about game strategy later. But from a tactician standpoint, I think I was also generally quite, speaking about adapting, able to know when we should play the more simple one flashbang, go up in the middle and kill a Danish player or Finnish player or whatever have you, or understanding that my roster was maybe consisting of players that had maybe a weaker entry fragging ability, a stronger AWP setup that would then steer us in another direction. And I think that is a little bit the explanation of us, generally speaking, over a quite extended period of time. To some degree, we carried this into CSGO, but I was definitely way less involved in that than the success story that was FNATIC CSGO until, maybe a few years ago. But just kind of being adaptive. I know if you ask someone like Tommy Lurpis, it was more like, you had f0rest and you just rushed us and my teammates, and it was nothing we can do because they was just so damn good at the game itself. But there was also those moments, maybe 2012, 2011, where the firepower of the team, again, touching a bit more on the strategical part now, but it still derives from this concept of knowing your strengths and weaknesses, as dull and boring that might sound. And I think that's something, just understanding kind of risk assessment, and within that you open up a complete, almost an endless amount of data sets, obviously some more valid and important than others, such as what kind of egos do you have in the team, how much time do we have to prepare.
Sure.
You have, the kind of classic book, struggle with the name now, but I think it's the guy who also wrote the Outliers and some of these books. Maybe it is Outliers, the kind of David versus Goliath. Maybe that's even the title of the book. But I think they, in that book, speak about this basketball coach in female basketball in America. He realized that all things considered, maybe the stamina of my players, the game experience, and the leadership in the squad itself out on the field in basketball, if we just play the game straight up, we are very likely in a set of 100 games, we're going to lose the majority of the games, or we will not win the critical mass of games in order to win the trophy. But what about we turn things around and we're playing overly aggressive, we are attacking them when we are supposed to defend, stuff like that. That's something again, now, if you would have asked me at that point, that very DreamHack, I would have no idea on how to even try unpack these things. Even if I did it in Swedish, my English is a little bit stronger these days after 10 years in UK, hopefully. But now I have had a chance to run a bit of a particle accelerator, like the one they have down in Switzerland, whatever, where I've very naively entered my team management early on, a bit head coaching days as a professional. Maybe thinking, again, naively that, well, this is how I did things and this is what I took for granted. Or maybe it's even more like a DNA or a kind of personality, the traits I had. I should just, you spoke, I don't know if that was actually, I've been speaking a long time now, so I don't know if you said this. Well, you said this in the intro, by like working with other people, whatever. You kind of take things for granted, you have really high expectations. Sure. But I learned a lot in that, so you touch it as well. I think actually in terms of like, some people are more like tacticians, but are they people managers in a sense? Yes. Exist, Richard is probably one of those examples where I was like a bit also stubborn, a part of me also like proud of this guy, because to some degree, well, we didn't really scout/discover him because he was still in the kind of tier 1.5/2 phase of Swedish Counter-Strike or Nordic Counter-Strike at that point, but it was in FNATIC that he kind of like was able to spread his wings. And I was like, well, I'm out of here, guys. We have a really good team. Carrigan was in that team as well, I think, at that point. And why don't you, Exist, become the in-game leader? Surely he had a great success story afterwards. Maybe not so much in FNATIC CS. Well, he never was in FNATIC CSGO, but we closed out CS 1.6 very, very well. But is that because he was amazing, kind of like carry on the torch and the mentality and ways of Patrik, cArn, Sättermo running in-game leadership? Or simply put, that maybe things was at a certain competitive level at that point, and the team we just have around us. What I'm trying to address is maybe that he was maybe not, he should probably not be classified as one of these guys that will just be like, knock, knock, knock on Get Right's door or another teammate, and just like, let's have a conversation on how we're playing these games. And I'm not too happy about you, like confrontation in a sense. But maybe super vocal, right? When it matters in the servers, freeze time, mid-round calls, maybe timeouts, if that even existed back then. But it's a very interesting subject. And in order to come to some kind of conclusion in my long monologue here, but also conclusions in terms of like leadership philosophy, what works, what doesn't work. And I kind of have seen everything working. Sure. But what I'm really am getting to a point to in terms of like being impressed about is when you typically say that it's easy to get to the top. It's hard to stay on the top, right? Kind of speaks for itself. Yeah. But I would say there is another layer, which is repeating success. So getting to the top, losing that positioning, and maybe in a different context, a different constellation of players, in a different Counter-Strike iteration or different map pool, being able to recreate that. And then it's almost inevitable to not think about names like a Sevs in CIS or a Carrigan is probably even best example, right? Both in CS 1.6 and early CSGO and late CSGO managed to just kind of, in a kind of conveyor belt way, producing success. At the same time saying that, I wonder what would happen, but this is just something we can run theoretically. What happened if CSGO would be a 11-man sport or 11-people sport? In terms of just the kind of people skill and the importance of such, because that's again like throwing it on the wall. Like I've seen everything kind of stick at the same time, but I'm getting like quite impressed and intrigued to understand the further kind of fabrics and layers to the ones that are really able to recreate things. And I've taken more so recent time a more modest approach. But things that have come to my mind now when FNATIC have changed also a lot as a business, we have probably less esport people these days, if you exclude my department, which is pro gaming, than we have people from, let's say, the corporate world, the world of traditional sports, the world of traditional medias or medium, talking about, setting up clear values. I do think that we had 2006 when I joined I gradually more and stronger values. But we were not probably very good at kind of defining those things, but they were kind of sitting in me. So if I could go back in time 10 years ago when I started my own journey as a team manager and trying to make sense out of things and put things in a more scalable way, because you're way less involved because you're not there in the freeze time. You're somewhat there in an off season, but at the same time you're not, especially as I employed a bit of a player knows best strategy in my early days of esport. That is something I changed a lot as well in terms of like, if I just would have continued to be like, yeah, players always know what's best for them. Actually, I, as a player, because I was a player and I define myself obviously as a player, but I knew best because maybe I also have a bit of leadership skill and able to put things in perspective and more holistically. But yeah, I don't know exactly where I'm going with this, but you would probably get better answer in terms of like, or rather a more accurate answer who Patrik is as a leader. But the last 4 or 5 minutes, I probably have spoken a bit what is close to my heart and brains when it comes to how I look at leadership and how I think and reflect about it. But I can also say this, doesn't maybe come across very modest. If I know what I know now in terms of like managing people, motivation, aforementioned values and setting such goal setting and so forth, obviously we would still have lost. Was a lot of great players back then, not in this context, in any need of mentioning this, because I think your audience is very clued up and understanding and know who these people are. But we would definitely have one more, and I would probably have played Counter-Strike a few years longer as well, because the roster that we had that I wasn't maybe seeing as much preciously as I should back in 2010, 2009, that some of those core pieces will probably have stuck together a few more years and rendered a bit more international success than they did. So that speaks a bit to getting to the top, super hard. Getting back to the top is actually the hardest. And I think I'm better equipped to do that now, but I'm also approaching a multi-game industry, which is per day becoming way more competitive. Thorin, speaking about DreamHack, there was a point FNATIC organization went to DreamHack and we were quite unhappy, or it wasn't really a big deal if we left the same DreamHack with, winning CSGO, winning in League of Legends, and maybe getting a bronze medal in StarCraft 2 on the same weekend. If I get that result over a quarter or even a half year these days,
sure,
I'm quite fucking happy in my job, yeah. But anyway, I kind of like covered your question, but at the same time, I didn't.
It's all right. Right, how about this then? Here's what I'll transition to. So you alluded to it there, right? Another thing that me and Lopez used to do, which, listen, it's half true, but we're also half being mean, obviously. It's like our fucking whole shtick, isn't it, as people, right? It was the angle that instead of just saying, like, well, yeah, cArn, you did win all those tournaments with f0rest and get right, blah, blah, blah. We made it more like, you won those tournaments with f0rest and get, like, we made the emphasis like that as though, like, because let's face it, by the way, it's actually a more abstract point. It's a general point I can make. which is in most sports, if you look at them, whoever the greatest players ever are, so obviously if you were like a basketball coach and you had Michael Jordan, etc., people are going to think it's easier to win with them, right? Because they're the best players. And in fact, the part where I do think they probably go way too far is they'll make it sound like you're just automatically going to win if you have these players, you know. But what I've noticed, actually, this is why I make it more abstract than just your specific case, is when you actually look at the great examples in sports, there are plenty of really great managers and coaches who didn't win with the best players sometimes, or, you know, it was like the wrong point in both people's careers, or what, you know, there's a million variables can come into it. So what I actually wanted to know was that, obviously you have had players like f0rest, like Get Right, even when you go beyond those names, you go to Delpan and Tentpole and DSL, you've had some very, very great players. You know, if we're making like a Hall of Fame, you'd have a lot of players that would get into it, right? What would you say to that topic of like, is there a degree to which if you have like f0rest, it is easier to win? I mean, I'm sure in some senses it can be harder, right? There might be different challenges to face with something like that. I mean, maybe in f0rest's case, people sometimes point out motivation might not be as great. You know, it's a bit harder to kick someone like f0rest if you just want to play for 2 months, right? You can kick a guy who's just an okay guy and replace him. So what would you say to this topic? How much sort of should you win if you have the best players? What are the challenges of doing it? Do you think that's overblown? Like, is it just something that a rival would say? Like, for example, he might not openly say this, but if I said to Threat, like, oh, it's unfair comparing you and cArn because, you know, he had f0rest and you had, like, I don't know, fucking whoever he had, Crystal or something, you know, someone not quite as good. What do you think on this topic?
It was a kind of long question, but I got it, right? And it's a very interesting subject. But I think kind of spontaneously everything you said can kind of happen at the same time in a sense, or everything can work, back to that kind of mindset. So I mean, I think there are also a few patterns here. You're speaking about FNATIC Counter-Strike, specifically FNATIC Counter-Strike 1.6 and the era of, let's say, 2006 to 2012, that many of those names that you mentioned, they also had their prime in FNATIC, or they got discovered more internationally and gained trophies and silverware under the FNATIC banner, and then you can maybe speak for hours on what does that suggest in terms of, like, from a performance platform standpoint, facilitating success, ability to understand what it takes to win. That's another thing I forgot to maybe mention as much as I should have mentioned it in the earlier question around, like, leadership and thinking what kind of produces great leaders. But yeah, something I look for way more now than in the past. Not exclusively, I should stress, because I think it's good with a quite, let's say, diverse set of players and different walks in life. But people that have been able to be successful in the past are typically the ones that are able to do it in the future, right? So f0rest is obviously one such example, because he went to Korea at age 16 and kind of carried that team to victory. Obviously, I don't know the complexities and the details of that very team on how they kind of produced that success, but he was definitely a big part of it.
Sure.
Equally, he was a big part of it in FNATIC. But in FNATIC's case, I think we also showed not as much after his departure, what is it then, like late 2010, that we still had certain success, and we brought a new school group of players to international fame. So the likes of Pita, actually at that point, he probably won his first international tournament with us, right? And that was in the time span of like a couple of weeks. He got into the kind of, well, as much as you can in a few weeks, obviously, but the way we thought about Counter-Strike and the way we run teams, the way we practice, the way we travel to tournaments and create brotherhoods, if you may. But anyway, I maybe realize I divert a bit from the question. So would I, as an example, or a DSN, or would a N-rated, or a, who can we have else here? A Steelback back in earlier parts of League of Legends would have been as successful or had that success without Huni in League of Legends at that point, besides having Reckless back in the early days of whatever it is, right? Maybe they never play with N-rated, but I just tried to throw some analogies your way, really. Okay. But it's similar there, right? Myself, without f0rest, yeah, we probably had a bit of success, but not as much, that's for sure. And that comes back, connecting the dots here, or attempting to connect the dots with the first point around, like, general leadership and what it takes to win, and how do you, mass produce that. I think you could end up in situation, I think we see it, and we could maybe going to speak to that in a few moments, who knows, in terms of, like, going international in Counter-Strike and the challenges of such in the past, and why that hasn't really worked in the past. But some in-game leaders, sometimes team owners or more senior team managers or coaches, I think they have maybe miscalculated on how they should best utilize the players and how they should make them comfortable in and out of the game. And that very part, making people comfortable in and out of the game, if I, again, a bit late to the party, but that's probably one of the strengths that we had in my team. And that was not exclusively what I brought to the table. It was also someone like DSN, the FNATIC organization, broadly speaking, at that point. And yeah, so staying on the f0rest, they went to SK Gaming, right? So we're late in CS 1.6 now, and they had what you could probably say the sickest lineup from a skill standpoint the world have seen. Yes,
sure.
Bit question mark on FaZe. Alan was there early, but I think he eventually retired also quite early. But they were very far from having success. It took them like 6-8 months later. They beat us all the time, surely. But yeah, this is all very interesting. So again, like, I would definitely not have been as successful without in-game leaders, but I would actually throw that, without the star players like a Get Right to f0rest, or even some of the earlier players that we had, who, yeah, like Archie had some prime as well, like maybe not the best player consistency-wise, but point is, I think it kind of goes both ways. So using the Michael Jordan example, from the sound of it, I don't know how much pepper, salt, and other seasoning the story and the documentary on Netflix actually has, and what is true and what is not. But it seemed to me that some of those other elements, the more supportive players, and maybe the Chicago Bulls, maybe less management, but the coaching question was also a big part of that success story.
Sure. Yeah.
And the most underrated thing I've seen now, and this goes into a more abstract yet super important point around like today's kind of baseline, what you get in the human beings that are prospective pros or current pro players in terms of values in life, what they've been used to, what benchmarks they have in the past. And I've landed quite comfortably in the belief that there should be way much more focus on becoming a great teammate. And that's something that was always very easy for me, organic to myself. I grew up with those values. I can't explain it further. Maybe it was kind of like, yeah, you grew up with Sweden and football in the 90s. Quite socialistic view on how you run a country, that we're in this together. We can only win by collaborating.
Right.
So when I think now again, it becomes very philosophical here, Duncan, but if you look at 20 years of competitive Counter-Strike now, yes, early movers advantage of great internet speeds, and I think also success breeds success. So when someone see a Potty or Heaton winning, and goes on TV, which he actually did very early on in the 21st century, that probably sets off like a Björn Borg generation, right? Like, I want to be that guy. But at the same time, I think there is something there in terms of like values, cultures, and way of approaching life. And yeah, it's underestimated and it cannot be understated, the importance of being a great teammate. And I kind of sense, but I'm in the FNATIC bubble, that people cared more about being a great teammate in the past. Like, people were willing, like, well, here comes my AK over to you. Here's my Deagle. Here's me running out with a fucking grenade in my hand when I attack upper on nuke, or I run out of train, and I know Markelov is going to hit 98 out of 100 shots when I run out here. But that's the percentage that we need to win the round. I don't see that as much these days, so that's something we have endless of work to do. It's just more like, it's not about me, it's about the team, right? At least it is, if you speak about team-based esports, and that's where the market is kind of gravitating to. There was a point, StarCraft 2, 2012, for example, was a massive year, 2011, but the most teams, and that's something I'm an advocate for as well, in terms of like commercial stability and long-term success and replication of success and building legacies. In my book, that's going to be easier in team-based sports, and that's also the stresses the urgency and importance of setting and building up great leaders within our organization. And that's actually what I spent the last 5 years on, taking a bit of a more limited approach to traveling, a bit limited approach to being on social media or interviews like this even, to just try to help the peers I have in the senior programming department and building really strong managers that knows the ins and out and works on a daily basis in the respective ecosystem. And from there, create kind of an infectious positive force that brings that kind of camaraderie and teammateship, if that works in English. But yeah, that's kind of what I'm working on day to day now, right? So I wish I started to think way more about this earlier, because I was like, yeah, exist. You know the game, you know the strategy. You were a great kind of sub-captain to myself when we competed. Hey, off you go. You become you're the in-game leader. You take care of player decisions, like I did back in the day, so to speak, right? But it wasn't that easy. Let's put it that way, right?
Right, what about this then? So I'll actually ask a very specific question now, not abstract like the concept we were talking about there, but it's tied into it, which is, you alluded to it earlier. If people did have that angle, I mean, actually, you could even use the SK Gaming example, because they went over and eventually they did start winning tournaments and winning SWC. People would have used that actually as the example that we're talking about to be like, oh, see, they would win with anyone, cArn. It wasn't about you. But already that year, you'd had, like, I think the ultimate sort of rebuttal, which was the IEM European Championship that you won, that you alluded to, where you brought in Peter and Exist and Delpan, and you remade the squad after Get Right and f0rest had gone. Right, this particular tournament, I wanted to know, do you see it the same way as outsiders? Like, outsiders, the storyline, if people don't know, was like this. At the end of 2010, when they had this amazing FNATIC lineup that just wasn't, it wasn't even that it wasn't good, it just wasn't as good as it wanted to be. So it broke up, and these star players left. And when they left, you had to basically recruit whoever was left over in the scene. Like, there wasn't actually that many top players available. You know, you had to sort of pick people and gamble on some people and take this guy and that guy and see, you know. Meanwhile, because the star players, as you say, went to SK Gaming, which on paper had an insane, it was like an all-star team, basically, like skilled players, every fan thought, what I was alluding to, it was like, right, well, they're going to win everything, and this FNATIC team's going to win nothing. Now, the first big event of this next year was this IEM European Championship. And if people don't know, the SK Gaming team didn't even make it out the groups. They actually just bombed completely and literally just left Ukraine and went home. Meanwhile, this FNATIC team incredibly actually won the whole tournament. And in fact, at a time when the pairs were considered very competitive, actually, if you go look at the top four of that tournament, all the other three are like the biggest teams in the world. It's like Na'Vi, MTW, the Pauls. Like, these are all teams that everyone expected to win. So I have to say, cArn, when you won this tournament in kind of like shocking fashion, like I say in the context there, most people do actually agree that, like, it shows that you must have had like some special skill as a leader, or people undervalued you. I'll even tell you a little funny detail. I won't say who it was, but within SK Gaming, where I was working at the time, one of the guys who was a manager at SK, this is how people just go so radically when something happens that they'll just overreact. He was just typing in this group chat like, how the fuck does he do it? It's just cArn. You can put anyone with him and he'll just win. And I was like, well, calm down. Like, look, it's only one tournament. But dude, people really bought into this storyline. Like, what do you think on this topic? Because, like I say, if it was a movie, that would be a fucking brilliant scene. Like, you know, like, what do you think? Because there's some truth to it, right?
Well, speaking about the movie opportunity there, with all respect to Ukraine, but Cyber Arena, quite smoky, dark, dull. Well, it was the best in class at that point, I guess. But
true.
I can think about, a similar story at a IEM Katowice right now would probably be quite baller Netflix material.
Yes.
But, you know, that was a tough time. So how long time do we have, Duncan? No, but let's just zoom in on the important part and connecting that with the question that you raised. So, I mean, pre-f0rest, pre-Get Right, and that kind of group. Gux was the third player, by the way, but he didn't join SK because they had a fallout as well because he didn't want to go to SK. That's also a separate topic. It kind of branches out quite quickly when we're speaking on old
exactly.
stuff. But anyway, so even before I played with f0rest, right, I managed to win international tournament, and I did it more than a few times. Well, I did a few times. Let's call it that. But obviously, he definitely accelerated that, or he was a catalyst. It enabled us to get a prime position from where we can recruit the next star in Sweden, because we kind of won the battle against the local NIPs or the SKs in terms of like who's going to get the next Get Right.
Yes.
A bit like G2 to some degree in League of Legends the last few years. Like, that's the team most players, not all, wants to go to.
Yes.
Anyhow, I mean, that was amazing live event for me. So, I mean, a few weeks prior to that, you know, obviously there was some dark moments, not just because it was December. I was back in Sweden. My grandma had just passed away. I was generally quite lost in life. Yet I was like, what was I, 24, 25? So I'm still a man to some regard, but very confused. Like, can I actually come back now? I'd spent years before, like, is now I should retire, whatever. So to some degree, this earned me a bit of a reignite, channeled through, you know, the long-term partnership and being a teammate with DSN, who I started to play with probably back in 2003. We kind of like just went on the market, and exclusively so in Sweden, and we tried to get someone called Nico, I believe. He was really good with the Deagle and some of the other weapons. That's not to be confused with today's Nico or the Nikos, but a Swedish Nico. But we landed on Pita, Delpan, and Exist. And Exist, I do think, had the chance to actually go to SK, and I think that would have settled their year to be the team of the year, because I think he could brought in some in-game leadership, or at least helped Robban on that part. But anyway, so that was really monumental in terms of like confidence boost. That is not to say that it was not a long time here, so we kind of made a final decision at DreamHack or just following DreamHack winter 2010, back in the days. We had a Christmas break, and then we are suddenly on planes over to Kiev mid-January or whatever. So it was like 2, 3, 4 weeks max of practice. Generally, still, I felt that we can go win this. The practice went really well, and we figured out a way to play the game. I think Exist was popping off. I mean, he had an amazing final. Sure. We found a way how to kind of, I wouldn't say use him, but to facilitate all that he brings to the game. He was a star player at that point. That is maybe a bit confusing to hear for someone that is only followed Exist through CSGO. Although he was a really good, as a very, let's say, holistically capable player. But he was definitely the star player in our team. And we had Delpan. He was comparable at times with the Markelov or even Starix. Sure. I think, they had a very unique situation with Navi. They had two of the best Operas at the same time in a very kind of AWP-friendly meta. But I recall that I got like a congratulations from f0rest at the after party, because I think what they just did after losing groups was that they probably told the same manager that you referred to at Eske, like, just get us the fuck out of
basically,
here and get back to the drawing board.
Yes.
But anyway, I got that message, and I kind of like, there was something inside of me, I think, and it's not me romanticizing this very, very long after, but maybe it was like I made it in a sense, or I was able to really show the same that I talked about for validation, like repeating success. And actually, there is something there that no one can take away from me now.
Yeah.
And that catapulted me. Although I'm definitely way more capable and more confident in myself these days as a team manager and making decisions and all of those things that I was. That was probably only starting like 3 years ago when I start to kind of like make sense out of everything that have happened in a very tough era where League of Legends, CSGO, Dota, maybe all of those teams losing at the same time. But it was quite life changing in that regard. That I'm not a hoax, you know. I shouldn't feel, which everyone does, right? Feeling like imposters at times, but. It was a really, really good moment. And obviously we were wrapped up that year, although in a different scene, in a different constellation of players, winning DreamHack the same year. So I think we won a total of 3 international tournaments that year. And I think if I would ask you, December 2010, or Lurpis, or many others out there, do you think this Fnatic roster will win any tournaments from this point onwards? I think the simple answer would have been no to that, but we showed that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But at the same time, I'm going to stress this. I do think entering to... And it's a bit interesting here now, actually. I'm curious to hear your thoughts as well. But 2011 Counter-Strike 1.6 is quite comparable to Counter-Strike in, well, let's say the year prior COVID. There was a point of time in Counter-Strike, like, Fnatic could go and win 5 consecutive events, 2 consecutive majors, I think, right? You have Astralis 2016 onwards. I mean, they're still very much staying on the top, and it's a remarkable story. Navi, not to be forgotten either, but you're having way more contenders now in a year of 365 days, maybe 20 events. You're not going to have like one team that is just winning like 68% of those events. It's very like, it's a rotating thing. Is very much now, again, being that consistent force and just being... And that's also like team management and leadership, basically, like being also able to reflect and making something good out of the losses. Because I've seen it, I've been there as well. Teammates, today's players as well, many of them, like, one loss equals game over. I cannot play with you again. You have betrayed me. You as an organization made this decision a few weeks ago or a few months ago. And that's something that is very impressive to see in the Navi right now, right? Becoming philosophical again, but you see Simple, for example, right? He speaks a lot on social these days about the excellency of his organization and especially teammates in terms of what they bring to the table for him. And that might be maybe some event he had a few years ago when he was kind of like, well, in order to actually win consistently, I need to think differently. I'm one of the best, if not the best player at that point. Now he's the best in my book. But just like, it's a team-based game, right? I have 4 other members and a coach. How do I make myself as good teammate for them? But equally, how do I as a teammate make them better? And that's very fascinating, that entire thing. And we thought very little about that in the past, and obviously a lot of work still to be done. But just that part, I think, without being able to describe it, was something that we kind of had it in the core, consisting of myself, DSN, and maybe the Fnatic organization back in the contract days, which allowed us to exist. We actually think you can be the best in the world. Delpan, you're fucking amazing in your AWP. We're going to play together, and this is how we do it. Here's the AWP. here's the scout. We're losing the CT pistol round. Just do what you fucking can. I don't care. If I have 0-15 and leave Kiev winning or silver, I would be happy with that too, probably. That's enough for me. And I think that's the interesting part, right? I mean, you have a lot of science and psychological assessments, whatever, in the world of sports, but team-based sports, in me, it's very much around like just building great teammates. And at times, obviously, that becomes maybe less important when you have the best player in the world, especially when we talk about esport titles, most of them having 5 members in the team,
Yes.
right? So yeah, leadership is important, but it's not like, it's not everything, obviously.
I actually have a question on what you're talking about now I'd like to tag on to. So I think you open up a very interesting topic that I'd like to ask something on. The follow-up is this. When you're talking about that premise there, the idea that, like, Simple's a great example, because I agree, by the way. He basically did, as far as I know, both publicly and talking to him privately, he basically had what you were talking about, that epiphany, which was already people were saying he was like the best player ever, like 3 years ago. But what he realised was, as you're saying, it's like if you were a fan, you'd go, well, I'm already the best, so it's not my fault. What he thought was like, well, no, even if I'm the best, if I can improve even a tiny percent, that probably wins us more games. And on top of that, even if I'm the best, like, individual player, maybe I could be slightly better for this specific teammate, as you're saying, right? That aspect is probably the most misunderstood part of Counter-Strike and team sport, in my opinion, because obviously it's not visible. Like, you'd have to know the conversations I'm talking about, people's philosophy. So in the server, people can only see, what we see on the scoreboard, they can see the movements you make, etc. They obviously can't hear the comms. Yes. So the question is this, right? I've noticed in Counter-Strike, and I fall into this myself, it is very easy to sort of just use your eyes and fall in love with the skill of a player. And so, for example, that whole conversation we just had about, like, when f0rest was in your team, there was almost an assumption built in there that because f0rest can shoot people in the head more accurately, he was overall, in all senses, the best player in the team. And, you're sort of facilitating him in some senses. Whereas, for example, if you span it to a different metric, like game understanding, maybe f0rest is the one helping you in that case. Maybe you're the one who knows where we should attack and how, and the tactical element, So basically the question is this. I agree with you. That's an area I also think your team, FNATIC, and in general, I would say a lot of the FNATIC squads that you've been a part of, actually, even maybe as a CGO, seem to have emphasised that quality. We used to say, me and Lopez, that it was just the social element. We thought you were just trying to be friends with the teammates. But I realise now it's kind of like what you're saying. It's like we're not just going to be what the SK lineup you were talking about was. It's not just going to be a bunch of skilled players, and then, if we win, we win. It's like we've also got to somehow actually build this into a team. Like, we've got to grow into each other, as it were. So give me some thoughts on that, because, like, a lot of people, like I say, I think a lot of people took that for granted and they just played Counter-Strike, mate. I don't know that many people understood the value of that, but it seems like it's been sort of a winning tradition within FNATIC to do that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think initially to that, the mistake many people do, and I probably do it across titles that I don't understand fully either, because it looks nice, it feels nice, it sounds nice when a highlight is happening in front of you, but what are the fabrics, what are the molecules and atoms that actually enable that very collision or thing happening just in front of us? So the mistake you do, I think, is just to look at, like, simple, and you look at the kind of typical, in-game metrics and comparing yourself in like a very linear way with the teammates, such as like attack damage per round, kill death ratio, entry frags, etc. But what you do need to realize, and what definitely Navi has realized, I mean, Navi has probably by a decent margin at that point taken a quite comfortable pole position in terms of the most kind of achieved and consistent Counter-Strike brand, if you limit it over the last decade, right? Because they did that in CS 1.6, they've done it over the last, 8 years of CSGO, on and off, surely, but Navi's always a contender, right? So that's very impressive, but sure. That's a side topic. So what you had to do, right, which is at this here's where I'm lost at the same time. And I'm going to try to unpack this. You're playing Dota, you're playing League of Legends, the roles, especially in League of Legends, are more defined, right? So you're the support or the AD or the mid lane or the jungler or the top. So it's quite, you have a lot of material to just kind of research and understand. You have a lot of like great talk shows, some of them you host, some of them other hosts, Riot is producing content, etc. They can be like, this is kind of baseline how you should do as a jungler, and these are the kind of best players in the history, and this is the meta, This is the patches and what it means. But it's not that simple in Counter-Strike Go, right? Because you're spawning on the map with the same kind of currency, the ability to buy weapons and running around in the kind of, three-dimensional maps. But where the outliers can be found, there's obviously the one that realized that there is whether we need to kind of properly define it as like entry fragger or backup or site anchor, that everyone just understands and reacts accordingly. Part of that is just preparation, leadership, and game knowledge, but it's also like at any given point of time where something is happening in front of you on the screen, in the kill feed on the side, communication and how do I, not only necessarily how I gonna run and kill the opponent by shooting them in the head and defusing the bomb after that, or maybe even avoiding them to planting the bomb, but how can I just think about this very situation and taking a bit of a helicopter point of view, looking down at it, like, what role can I play here? Okay, let's look at the radar. Let's look at the health bars. Let's also, by muscle memory, realizing who's really comfortable in this situation. Just that as an example, right? I never got to the same kind of, and I can't speak for f0rest, but you can kind of see how fluid his gameplay was, right? Like just running out in an open area or strafing behind a box or doing a jump to break someone's defuse, for example. Just kind of lure him to look at you, for example. Very fluid, very smooth. So how do I then in real time take advantage of that? So I'm 2 versus f0rest. And it's kind of back, maybe it sounds very simple now, but well, I might as well be the one that is just suiciding here and killing the second out of the 2 opponents left on the map and letting f0rest do his shit, right? And I think as easy this sounds to you, probably, and as easy it sounds to me to say, and how basic maybe it sounds for everyone, but in the battle, on the servers, in the boot camps, in the post-game discussions, this is actually a quite confusing element almost, like in terms of maximizing not your own individual success, extrapolated over even a tournament or a year versus the team's success. So a few moments
like
ago,
people would be surprised if they knew how many pro players have these arguments still, right? They're going to think they take for granted this premise we're discussing, right? But a lot of pros would argue like, oh, but I could have done X, Y, and Z if I'd have been alive in that moment. Yeah, there's a lot of like short-term thinking.
Indeed. And also, what I see sometimes is that, and I'm going to struggle maybe to express myself here, but that people are talking about the right way of playing the game. And I think there are right and wrong ways of playing the game, but they also do that in the context of myself, regardless of my arsenal in that very moment almost, and regardless of what teammate I have next to me. I think there's a lot of players not even capable because they have a different kind of game sense to understand who they are next to. Like, I was quite good at that. And I think it has a lot of reasons, like the way you may be sitting and watching, the way you're looking at your teammate's screen when that was possible, or your ability to tab and make a quick visual assessment on who's left, etc. But people are high level looking at it from an assessment of, I'm an individual contract player in a situation such as 3-on-3, and this is stereotypically on how this should be played, rather than doing that, but also extracting what is my team, what is the profile, what did we talked about before the game and all that stuff. I mean, we can write books about this stuff. We're not going to figure it out and be able to distill it down even further than in a very like 2-liner. But high level, it's about really thinking as a teammate and doing that in the context what has been pre-agreed and planned with the 4 teammates of you plus the coaching staff that you have. And I think at times it's good to kind of go beyond that in a sense, in that very moment. At times, just I got this sound cue. I was told by my in-game leader to do default round, but I'm going to open up the round here. You even have that and such move being successful, and there are in-game leaders that are a bit upset because the ego has been lost. Like, why are you doing that?
Right.
Because then you open up the round, 5 versus 4. Maybe the guy who did that move died just a moment after, but that's back to the in-game leadership, that adapting, everything that's just happening on you. Just break that down into, not Rubik's Cube, because I don't think it's that complex, but it's kind of an elimination game. What's happening in front of you? Because a lot of people a lot of in-game leaders especially, and players perhaps, they get just thrown off very early in the round. Like, you know, for example, here's an example, I guess. On Train, back in 1.6, very different to today, you could throw nades over the kind of B holes, right? To the inner bomb site. And that created a sound cue, but maybe more so on the pistol round especially. It created a lot of fucking damage.
Of course.
And there's just so many people at that point when that happened, they get defeated. And not only defeated in terms of that very round, but just mentally that they cannot just cope. And a percentage is happening on a like odds basis. Are we going to win this round or not? or are we going to win this game or not even? Are we going to win this tournament? Are we going to stick together as a team? But the best in-game leaders at that point are just the one that are like, this just happened, but this is the solution. Now our chances, because maybe, I don't have the stats, maybe you ask the HTV guys, they might still have that data. Let's just say, as an argument, that you in T-pistol rounds on train have 40-60 of winning or losing, right? So you're still at disadvantage, but you play in a certain way, you can kind of like make the best out of those 40 in that very moment. But let's say after that nades hit you, you blow 200 HP across your team out, you're revealed. Okay, statistically your odds is now 25%. So it's back to the kind of basketball analogy I talked about earlier. And why am I saying this? I guess it's just like to try to portray a bit on like what is making consistent success and, you know, legendary teams, because those legendary teams is able to do the best out of this situation versus just like, what the fuck, mate, what happened there, right? Because we all get frustrated, and being able to find lightness in the darkness, so to speak. I mean, those are the kind of pillars when I think about leadership and success, broadly speaking, but I don't know at this point if I answered your question on this.
No, it's good. Right, I'll keep it going. So here's how I would segue it. Now I want to talk a bit about being the CGO in FNATIC, the Chief Gaming Officer.
Yes.
Now, I have to say, the interesting thing to me is this, right? When you were talking there about like the different qualities of a teammate and like as an in-game leader, how you would be able to kind of figure out who is legit in that sense and what basically, very good point, is what they're capable of, because obviously, you know, the perfect tactic isn't the perfect tactic if your teammates can't execute it, right? When you do that, out over the years from following a lot of different esports games, and especially games like League of Legends and Dota, which totally aren't my game, like, you know, it's an alien world to me. I had to totally immerse myself into them to get even like a basis of the game, even though the specifics of the game are obviously very different to Quake and Counter-Strike. I actually do think essentially there are almost like universal qualities to competition and like competitors' mindsets, even how teams function. Some of these principles, in my opinion, go beyond the game. They're like basically it's like human nature essentially, and like how do we communicate, all that jazz, right? So I do actually think one of the areas I even if it sounds arrogant, that I think, for example, in League of Legends, I will disagree with people I think are experts in League of Legends who do know more about the game with me. If, for example, we're talking about something that's like a very fine judgment, like, for example, do I think this guy will become like, you know, a true champion player? So it's not about his skill at the game, it's like his mentality and what's his, you know, that sort of stuff. So I do think some of that stuff crosses over, and you can sort of get similar, like a feel for players, or you can think you can see something. But I wanted to know, how much of this do you actually apply yourself? Because if we're talking about CSGO, the game is close enough to 1.6 that, like, I'm sure you can trust your opinion about a lot of things and what your eye sees, right? But people will know, yes, the CSGO teams had a lot of success in your time as a CGO, but the League of Legends teams also had a fantastic amount of success, and that's obviously not a game that was your world at all. So what I want to know is this: when you are the CGO, and both these teams, League of Legends and CSGO particularly, have done a very good job year on year recruiting new players, even picking when to sort of let another big name go or not sign them, etc., right? When you do this, how much of it is like delegating, find someone else? I know, for example, when I used to work with SK Gaming, that's basically what my boss there, Alex, did. He used to just sort of have a guy in each team that he really trusted, like it would be like Roban or someone, you know, and his notion was, this guy will sort of tell me who I should recruit. And as long as he's legit, then, you know, the rest of it falls into place. Do you do a system like that? Do you actually use your own eye for it? Do you have a whole team of people? How do you do it? Because you've been the only consistent part. If people don't know, even in League of Legends, I was always puzzled myself, because behind the scenes, when I would talk to people in League of Legends FNATIC, it feels like the manager people are different every 2 years, but you're the only one who stays. So what's the secret? What's your approach to how you've been able to help these teams continue to build like winning traditions? Like, how much do you apply yourself? How much are you involved? Yeah,
so I'm gonna have to ask that in a kind of, I'm gonna have to segment that in kind of different kind of timelines in a sense. But the fact you stated at the end, right? Like you see a massive rotation in leadership in League of Legends specifically. If anything, that's a failure, right? I would argue at times it's the right call, or I respect those decisions obviously, but what you want to have is maybe what Alex talked about, is a ambassador, a leader on the ground that is empowered and entitled to work with the team. Obviously bringing the kind of FNATIC culture, the FNATIC values, and my mentorship, hopefully, into those decisions. And that's more, and staying in the timeline of the recent years, that's where I put a lot of gunpowder in. I've learned my fair share of lessons in terms of hiring, interviewing, onboarding, knowing when to be present on the ground or involved in conversation or not, but still an enigma, right? There's no fully like here's the Bible, here's the right or wrong in a sense, right? As just a comparison to the religious world. So it's one aspect, like replicating success once again. League of Legends specifically, it's a very interesting subject in that regard. I agree, broadly speaking, that we have had a lot of success, and I'm probably one of the few, if not besides Sam, the founder. But compared to an Alex at SK and many of those other super big organizations out in the world, the CEO is not that involved, right? I mean, he kicks me in the ass sometimes and confronts some of the decisions I may be suggesting that we should take when maybe a DocuSign is reaching the inbox and stuff like that. But point is, I've had the luxury of having a long runway now of kind of testing things out, learning a great portion. And also you will know this, Duncan, and the people that have been around in the industry and following the respective esports, that a lot of things have changed over time, right? So speaking about Counter-Strike 1.6 in 2011 was that good example. Maybe CSGO today it was not like just one or two teams that was trading trophies. Like in League of Legends right now, that has also changed, although that took a bit longer for whatever reason. Before it was kind of Origin/G2 and FNATIC, and now it's more of like 5, 6, 7 team story. But still, I mean, we're able to render quite decent result. I mean, now we are a bit on uphill battle to some degree if you refer to loser bracket as
a rebuild.
Such.
Yeah, sure.
But we have gone through radical rebuilds in the past. Elements of luck, having the right managers at the right time, then maybe failing to kind of bring them into the organization and replicate that through them the next year. But, 2014 is probably actually the great example, and one of those examples that will go into my imaginary autobiography in terms of success stories, where very late in the season, I think for good competitive reasons, and some of these players have also then kind of clocked in on like 3-4 years of competitive play, which is a long time in an early esport, because you will probably see, right, like in Valorant right now, some of the absolute best players today, 2 years from now, they would be non-existent. They would be a caster or a head coach or general manager, etc. So it was kind of the right time, but it was also at our absolute peak. So I was actually in FNATIC's All Hands just a few moments ago, and one of the community managers that runs Discord and outreach and fan clubbing stuff spoke a bit about, like, even when we lost to Alliance, this is 2013, I believe, everyone celebrated FNATIC. We were really at the height of what you can possibly be in a certain ecosystem. I remember, coming over to Paris or Madrid, and I was still a bit new and a bit baffled around League of Legends, but you heard kind of FNATIC starting from the metro over to the venues, in the venue or even outside the venue was very much a FNATIC thing. So picture a world where the Xpeaker, Yellow Star stayed, Reckless went to Elements, Cyanide, I think he retired, but he kind of followed Xpeaker into Origin at that point. That became Astralis in the recent years. And I think Soas, was it? Probably.
He's in Origin as well, yeah. He
also followed, right? And we, at that point, we went to Worlds. I think this was Worlds in Singapore, perhaps. So we had quite limited time, and I was burnt out. We had management changes. I think Aranea, the team's coach, was also not following into the next year. It was me and a guy called Oliver, that, especially him, I should stress this, really interesting guy, great guy, really, colorful personality. He had, throughout our Worlds bootcamp, came across some players in Korea that he was very intrigued about. And those players were in academy structures of the SKTs of some sort, but they weren't really ready for the local scene. And those were the players we went for. But I don't know how far into the details I should go, but just kind of trying to kind of give some color and context to some of those epic elements of our success stories when we have rebuilt an entire team and brought in a bit of a FNATIC vibe. There's been luck, there has been the right timing, because again, I spoke about FNATIC being at the height of this is the brand in Europe you want to play for. Even if we maybe didn't go the furthest in Worlds out of the European teams at that point, we could still get some of the best teams in Korea. But as things are changing and segueing into let's say a more recent time frame, it's very much now to really think long term, and not to bore you to eternally here, right? But how we build, gaming facilities. I think we've done a poor job on that so far. Mental coaching, health programs, all of those things. So last year, and I spoke a bit about this when we relaunched CSGO, going from Sweden to international, that we are in FNATIC now, having what is called a high performance unit, or the HPU. I have the last 8-9 years had many hats in a sense. I mean, everyone says that I had many hats and blah, 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 but literally many hats in a sense of being very hands-on, at times forced to be very hands-off for good reasons, also stepping in at times, kind of in a coaching function, but also a lot in a growing business next to Anne, Sam's mom, and himself, a company that had grown from 20 people 4 years ago, 5 years ago, into now 100 people, doing social media, signing sponsorship deals, doing investment raising and whatever. And all this world next to us, the sports world, which we come from and we've been very good at generally, has kind of obviously, a lot of things have changed in that layer as well. That's all, so what I'm trying to point at here, that we had to make a big shift in terms of how me in this case, am involving myself. So the focus should be more around setting up a robust structure internally, how we are more systematically approaching off seasons, contract negotiation, contract extensions, how we're thinking about what kind of staff members are we looking to have, how much time are we willing to even give success in a world where success is harder, frankly speaking, right? Mad Lions Rogue, it took their fair chance to get to the level they are now. If they would just have broken up and just let's not stick to our values, let's change things radically, then maybe we wouldn't maybe at that point had a different LEC winner for the first time in 8 years or whatever since Alliance won the moment I spoke a minute ago. So point is, very much in the past, working very shoulder to shoulder, at that point probably Skype calls, just really last minute, really passion, random elements, but leveraging from the FNATIC brand and the passion we bring hopefully to those individuals that were interested in working with us, and recreating success from that part. But now it's more we need to take a proper deep breath, as in I have to, meaning the last 3-4 years have been very much around finding strong team directors in the American world. That would be general managers. So we have a Javier in League of Legends right now. We have an Andreas in CSGO. We have a Jaden in Rainbow Six, and we have Eric in Dota. We have a Colin in Valorant, and so forth. And there, with a high performance unit in which we have the performance elements and the standardizations of such on this is the player test we do, this is the protocol of facilities and practice and all that. I mean, we're very early on in this, which might baffle people because we've been around for so long, but we have, again, done our utmost to survive as a business, to scale a business, which is not the easiest in a world where ultimately the IP holders, the IP owners of a game like League of Legends, CSGO, it's they have a big poker hand in front of you, and you need to, in those restrictions and those conditions, try to figure out how do you sell sponsorship, how do you sell products, and all of those things, right? So yeah, people don't really get, and maybe I'm very confusing now, but it's a completely the reality is this, Duncan, FNATIC is actually way more capable today of leveling up players to having a more linear, well, I would say post-COVID, this is going to be easier when we can physically meet people more, but to really have a proper onboarding and bringing people to the FNATIC core than we maybe had a couple of years ago. But the passion we had at that point, the early movers advantage we had, and at times maybe the genius and the confidence we had, because many teams would at that point, when we lost XP, they would just go for the kind of next player, right? I don't know if that would have been f0rest, for example, here's at that point maybe $200,000, crazy amount of money at that point,
sure,
still today, and go for him. But we were there's something here, there's a seed that is very interesting, and we've done certain assessments on those other options, but this is what we go for. But then obviously you had morons like myself who didn't go in as aggressively, this is going to be a 2-year commitment for you, brother. If you're going to come here, we're going to bring your visa, blah, blah, blah. And yeah, those are the kind of big, but yeah, I'm still quite proud of the journey in the sense that the last 16 years of esports as multi-team organization, which I actually have to force myself these days more than before to measure myself as, not that I didn't care about the smaller titles, but I just have to realize and function as a human being and as a leader of other team directors and the players down the road, right? We might have a poor season, but as long as we have certain success and we can be proud of the product, the performance platform we're building, that we are able to level up players, we're able to make, proper decisions in a sense that makes sense, and we think long term. And maybe we qualify for TI, we go far in that. We are rebooting CSGO now. We actually make it out of loser bracket, etc. That would be all great, but there was definitely a point where maybe only 4 or 5 years ago, it was almost life is over if we don't win a major in CSGO or we don't make it to Worlds in League of Legends. And maybe that was the fuel at that point that you needed to just really work those 80 hours and be on those late calls, etc. But now we're setting up for scale because, you also see a world which is changing a lot in terms of esport titles and the relevancy and maybe the longevity of such. You have the outliers like CSGO, League of Legends, Dota, maybe Call of Duty, but we see a world that changed from 20 years ago. Esport was an accident. There was fans creating the games out of single-player games like Half-Life, well, semi-single-player games, to now being like featured multiplayer functions only, social elements. Fortnite maybe is one example. And how do we actually make also damage and build our company on those premises over time, right? So I don't know if I'm super confusing now, but yes, there is something in it in terms of like just the core and the philosophy that I think someone like myself have maybe brought. Maybe speak about passion and ability to work really long hours and get people to join me in that cause. But maybe a bit of overwhelm, like things have probably we have reached an overwhelming or a point of being overwhelmed in terms of the amount of things that we need to be really good at, that forces someone like myself to just not be a stupid guy thinking that I can solve all of these problems myself. But the way to properly scale now is to build those team management structures that I talked about a minute ago. So if we, just for the sake of example here, Duncan, 5 years ago, 90 per every team, let's say there was 85% player salaries, maybe 10%, 5%, whatever, team management, and the rest is maybe operations like facilities, travel, etc. Okay. That maybe now over time, and obviously there will be differences when we want to go in big and really make a statement and get the player that it can create a lot of ripple effect and domino effects. But now it's more like, what academy structure can we actually build surrounding this, and what do we need over time? Because there is, and obviously, it's a challenging business being an esport team right now, but it's also a challenging thing to be an esport team at this point. If you have those ambitions of being the best in every title at the same time and just following the arms race, which is, kind of accelerated by the arrival of LEC, where you had a complete bloodbath of 6 new joiners, I think, joining the fray, willing to spend tens of millions of dollars on players and licenses alike. They maybe have a different kind of runway and different kind of supporting. But I think we're getting to a really good place. I kind of camouflaged in all I talked about and have been talking about this 45 minutes now, whatever. I think we're setting ourselves up for a lot of success, but in order to set ourselves up for that success over time and scalability and predictability, there will also be, challenges and defeats around the corner. And I've learned to better cope with those, but I feel really miserable still. I'm going to stress that, but now it feels you're landing in a bit of a warmer place when you also know that you have people that have done everything they possibly can in the name of FNATIC, and they are the day after a defeat back in work and trying to learn from that, also powered by the same high performance unit, where we're going to try over time to scale to a point that we have the best in class resources and talent across health, even down to like mechanic training on reflexes, precision, eye measurement, like all those things, down to the actual infrastructure and the facilities, because we have so much work to do there. And hence why there needs to be a reconfiguration on how companies also spending money. In our case, where we see a future facility, for example, might be more interesting to put money towards than making one single player for one season super happy financially, if that makes sense.
Sure. Right, what about this? When you keep saying this term like values, like the values of FNATIC, your values, normally when people say that, I do sort of roll my eyes, because it's very much like they're the buzzwords in the management world, of course. People are always talking about like corporate synergy and all these fucking words that they have in all the PowerPoints. But here's the thing, right? Normally, the reason I also roll my eyes is because when it's like literally just a company, like if McDonald's, on Twitter, it's like our corporate values are this, it's like that's just branding, like that's what they want you to think of McDonald's as, right? It's not necessarily true. But in this case, right, the reason why I can actually like approach this topic is if I just think of it like, I'll give you a sports analogy. If I think of what Alex Ferguson would say his values are as to what sort of player he wants, he's not just meaning like some airy-fairy, like, any words. What he means is like, maybe he likes players, for example, who don't mind being criticised, or people who arrive early for training, whatever. Like, his point is he's sort of giving you the vibe of like, this is the sort of person I want around me in my team.
It's a no bullshit approach, right? So similar, I mean, exactly. Maybe it's not visible, but I've also been, and to some degree, when certain companies, certain people talk about values and like all those things, standardization, certification, whatever it might be. So I hear you on that, and I think you used a good example of where I can, fuel up motivation and get inspired by like a Sir Alex Ferguson, and without necessarily being like super specific here, but let's just say the following: that as a CGO, as a team director, as a head coach, like anyone working in a sports environment, anyone walking the surface of life or whatever, they make a lot of decisions all the time, right? But just for the sake of argument, I have to make 5, 6, 7, hopefully good decisions every day, like that can have macro impact over time. On a team director basis, that maybe is 15. Maybe on a team manager, that's 25, because it's more logistically, like how do we get from A to B, etc. Head coach is maybe a lot, right? Because you have to like really take in the game, a very fast changing game. What lens do you look at those decisions from? Have we had, I'm saying the word brutal here, but I'm not saying brutal in the terms of like, try to bulldozer over people and be completely radical and crazy and aggressive. That's not my point, but being really firm and humble in terms of what are the when I see through the lens of my values on these decisions, how does the outcome that I'm trying to achieve actually look like? So that could be like teammate ABC or player called player X in team Y is incredibly good at the game Y. He does not represent what we think needs to be represented from let's say, being a teammate, being someone that is open for feedback, being someone that has a public messaging that is healthy, that we feel also propel us to a place where 5 years down the road, that player that we would have wanted to plant the seed in terms of like, this is a place I want to call home one day and I want to contribute to this mission and so forth. We have been extremely bad at this. I think we are way better today and we need to be way better tomorrow. But I think many of our competitors, they don't even think in this context in a sense. I think some people do than others. I really like the Liquid guys, for example. I think they have strong values. It's a certain vibe to the team. And I think that comes... that's a bit an explanation where they year after year, especially since the merger with, was it Curse back in maybe 2014, be it CSGO, Dota, League of Legends, they have just rendered consistent results. Not winning everything all the time, but like really being up there, right? So that's a good example. And I think FNATIC is another good example where now it's like, well, if I have a data set in front of me, we should look a lot and look deeply into the game-specific stuff and like mechanical skills, achievements. I talked about earlier the importance of like bringing people that have actually, especially in a new team, having someone that know what it takes to win, that have had that in their, like they have lost their virginity, so to speak, in terms of winning. But at the same time, you need to also look at those, let's say, more soft values, which I think is hard values at the same time, not to confuse you, but being a teammate, being a part and being interested, like we did this in CSGO now. We intentionally went for players that we felt have an interest of taking care of their health, that want to maybe one day centralize to a facility or do a more radical life change in order to become better. That's a little bit what we went for. Whereas before, again, it was very much like, I wouldn't say finger in the air, but more like hardcore, raw game skills. You got that, you might have a future in FNATIC. Now it's, you need to have that, but these are the other checkboxes that you need to fill. And I'm not going to sit here and preach and just be like all those kind of catchphrases in my Swedish English in front of you. You're probably going to very much roll your eyes at that point. But we have like 5 company goals. They are further to be distilled. 5 company values that just should overarchingly guide us forward. And it's very performance oriented. So we have had, after a lot of like discussions internally, have kind of come back to the idea that winning is important, which obviously makes sense, right? But just like sport performance, that's the starting point. That's the lever we need to always kind of pull in order for everything else to ever work out, like securing sponsorship, creating cool content, educational material, FNATIC gear, whatever have you. But I have definitely work to do on that. But our ability to put this into system and replicate this over time, when you have a strong team management, which I think we have today, and the average time current team management has been in FNATIC is probably close to 3 or 4 years, which is a long time. You see a lot of, I mean, in the past, it was like... It's almost like being the general manager for England football, right? It was like, you make it one championship and you're out almost, if you're lucky. But Sorry, got something in my throat. Haven't gotten over the loss yet, I guess, against Italy. But anyway.
True.
Well, I'm Swedish, I should stress, as probably everyone knows. Yeah, so that's what I mean, Duncan, when I talk about values. I'm not talking about like
All right.
more abstract than that. It's just more like, let's actually run through that those set of checkboxes besides just looking at great players. And that's, I think, simple is an interesting example there. I don't speak the language. I'm maybe just an armchair general now, looking from the outside in and thinking I know shit, right? But from what I hear, you kind of validated that as well when we spoke a bit, back in this conversation. Just like, I'm a really good player, but what if I level up those other attributes and I could be a positive force for the people around me? What then happens? And obviously the easy answer is, but that's going to be a positive outcome. But just to go through that steel bath, which is, I am so fucking great. The numbers shows it. The fans are seeing it.
Sure.
I have some silverware to prove it. But to still then force yourself to make a level up moment to your inner self, your consciousness, your self-ego. I mean, that's where I need to learn myself. I'm a stubborn individual. I was about to say a curse word, but I'm not going to say that. But that's also what we want to kind of portray and mirror over to our players, right? And that does, again, just to finalize, being a great player or on the way to becoming a really great player and showing signs that you're willing to learn the other side of the things, being a greater teammate, essentially. Those are the traits we're looking more deeply into now and making decisions from. That was also what led us to making quite radical changes in the mid-season of 2020 this year. Sorry, 21 this year. In League of Legends, we felt that from all things considered, the set of options we have in front of us, this is going to be the best one because we're looking at this from those values and this vision. Okay, so hopefully that explains it.
Right, one last major question I had before I go, just because I think I'd be remiss not to ask you this, which is this, right? There's a piece of trivia which, listen, now it never happened, so for now it's just a fun thing that like could be on like a Wikipedia one day, because it just sounds so mental, which is like Thorin could actually have been the FNATIC League of Legends coach. This is a real thing that was actually like, at least it was an idea that was floated, I'll put it that way. It was never actually happened, obviously.
It's advanced, right?
Yeah, and basically this was at the end of 2014. Obviously, the team that you had instead, I will say, by the way, there's almost no way the results could have been as good. Like, without that, you won both the splits. You got the Daylor guy who became, I think, probably the best coach at the time. Obviously, went top 4 at Worlds, top 4 at MSI. Like, basically, the year couldn't almost have gone any better, you know, like, it was actually better. So, in reality, it's actually probably better that it didn't happen. But the reason I want to ask you is this, 2 factors. One, obviously, most people will know, like I alluded to earlier, I don't consider myself an expert in League of Legends. Like, in CSGO, I am arrogant enough to think, even though I was never a pro player, I do know better than people who are pro players. But the difference is in League of Legends, I would never claim that, right? I just think I know like general things about how teams work and competitors and that sort of jazz, right? So my question is this, right? Obviously, we've never discussed this publicly. I think fans would be interested to know why would you pick me for something like that? Because in this scenario, what I was describing about you being the CGO, etc. If someone like me joined, what if I'd fucked it up? What if I was terrible? What if like, it was the worst year ever? And then everyone's like, right, cArn, you have to actually recruit real people now, not people from Counter-Strike. Like, what was the logic behind why you even thought this was like worth it? Because it was obviously a gamble, right?
Sure. Yeah, a lot of water under the bridge since. So what is the logic I felt at that point back 7 years ago? Staying on values, do you, Duncan, Thorin, Shields, represent our values today? Well, questionable. Let's have a conversation about that. But indeed, I do think it was a seed in terms of, I mean, you're a great man, by the way, don't get me wrong. I love your work. What I was trying to say, that was probably a bit of a seed in terms and an early attempt to maybe using an Apple catchphrase now, like think differently in a sense, right? So the stereotypical way, the traditional way, the conventional way, and maybe the expected way you as a CGO or a CEO hiring a head coach would be, well, let's find someone that is really fucking good at the game because I'm not really good at the game. But I felt I need more so someone that can kind of lead, inspire, bring in a certain way of maybe approaching things versus which is not, you have that in head coaches, right? Because the typical head coaches I'm still talking about in terms of like, yes, game know-how, this is how I draft, this is how I want my warding done, this is rotations, this is how I see about shot calling and risk taking and baron fights and whatever have you. That's all fine. But if you can only master that part, it's almost, to me, I'm not convinced, I'm going to say this, but if if you cannot touch both the kind of outside goal setting motivation, setting kind of a cultural code and a cultural compass, and if you can't do that, I think you're going to really struggle over time. I think a year's time is maybe very limited. And I'm not saying just a year's time, because that's the kind of time capsule we talk about here, that was your opportunity to join FNATIC. It was what Daylor did, but we extended him for a year. But we started to think more like, what have we had before, what has not worked, etc. And I can't, in better words, actually describe it, but you can say that I think maybe Lewis Daylor in question that we went for in the end, because I think it was you saying no to us at the end, but I do, however, think, and this is not me fabricating the past, Duncan, but if there was a position where Daylor, who we went for, and you were like on the last line, like decision making, it's very likely Daylor would have been the guy, because he was very much this hybrid that I was trying to refer to a moment ago. In terms,
he already had a background in coaching poker and stuff. Yeah, I mean, he was a much better candidate. If people don't know, of course. Yeah.
But the point is that he wasn't. He was everywhere on the spectrum in the sense where he had capabilities. He saw also. It's not necessarily that you have the skill set, but he had a wider spectrum and a work ethic that I haven't seen until today, almost in terms of like just willingness to just come in. I think he spent the first month, maybe even 2 months, and that's a long time in a split, bear in mind, to just kind of analyze and think, taking notes and trying to break down into, I don't know exactly how he did it, he's a genius, but I imagine that he maybe broke it down to like, okay, we have a set of 20, let's call them core issues or core problems, but what are the underlying pattern between those? And then I start to pull those levers, and that resulted in obviously one player change prior to summer split. It resulted in one of our most successful years. But yeah, to kind of wrap up things here, I suppose, Duncan, is just like, we're reaching an era, and we were probably quite early on that. So you were involved in that regard, right? That we just didn't think like, game knowledge, game skills equals success. But you need that, but you also need this other part, which is ability to lead, to inspire, to confront, to problem solve. I mean, it's a very male-oriented business right now, the competitive side of esports. You see this in more or less every title. I think you have a few exceptions, obviously. And one of those kind of pillars that I've realized, and I realized probably around that time, is that many of these players, they need good male role models as much as they need guidance in game. They probably need more good male role models than they need help in game. Yes. Because they can resolve those other pieces in terms of like, these are some of the values you should have when you become a man and becoming an adult, and how you interact with other people. And this is not to open up another kind of can of endless conversation / monologue perhaps, but the absence of today's generations of players' absence or lack of benchmark from the traditional world of sports, because they grew up with Fortnite, with League of Legends being there at a very early age. I'm just thinking, if I got access to a broadband connection at age 5 instead of age 11, if I fell in love with FPS, Quake, and eventually Counter-Strike at an earlier age, it's very likely I wouldn't have proceeded at all in football, floorball, and other sports. But I'm happy I did, because I think despite obviously those coaches you had back then was maybe a dad of one of the other players, it did something too in terms of thinking it's not that you should think in any box way in every kind of problem thing, in every problem solving you do. But there is I think it's a bit under check now, or is being more monitored and controlled. But there was a point of time when the esport business scaled, and I spoke about it a few moments ago, that I was quite lonely in terms of like team management. I was a CDO, and I was running maybe between kind of star players or team captains, sometimes coaches, meanwhile running a business on the same time. So the arrival of team managers and frankly speaking, some older staff and more adults, and having more adults in the room. But that kind of era, let's say 2013, 2017, 18, I wish right now that we have injected people that come from just traditional sports or just leadership roles, even if they know nothing about the game. Because I think FNATIC Counter-Strike would have gotten maybe another major if that would have happened. We went to Atlanta, Georgia, losing to VP in the best of 5. I think we lost 3-2. We're sitting in the hotel bar, and then shit just, I mean, it's not that people was drinking. We were sitting in the bar because that was in the lobby. And suddenly we make a decision that we're going to break up the team. And the team stays with Dennis and Olof. But what about we had an, on-site team director with more people management skill and less game skills, for example? What would have happened then? So yeah, conclusion is, I think we fought right in terms of like approach, even back then. It didn't manifest in you joining us at that point. It went for Daylor, but it was around the time we started to set in motion something more like trying to actively confront some of those challenges. And we're getting to a better place, but the place we're also looking out from now, the vantage point of August 2021, is an extremely competitive environment. So having a few trophies, I want to have more, I want to have all of them, but the work cannot stop. That's the thing I've learned the last few years.
Right, at the end of this interview, do you have like a final message or anyone you want to thank or say hello to?
No, basically everyone that has ever worked for FNATIC or currently work for FNATIC. I mean, I know the work that goes in, and not to kind of like, compare the sports department versus other department. Everyone in FNATIC actually works really, really fucking hard, but it's been a tough period with some great moments as well. I would say, like H1, as in first half of 2021, we were in a really good spot, all things considered. Maybe save CSGO, but the other titles. But yeah, all the work and all the learnings that we can derive from these people, but obviously also all the fans out there. I don't know how useful this session and how many people and what kind of drop you have from the first 5 minutes and the more ambush bombastic questions in the beginning to this very last segment. But yeah, the fans, love referring to them, the fans, the followers and the supporters out there. We start to see more of those, and that's very interesting in terms of like people sticking with us through the good times and bad days and the different constellation of players. Because you can imagine the first half, using 2015 as an example, losing XPK, losing SOAS, losing Reckless, it was really tough, right? In terms of like just following and hype around FNATIC. But when we managed to redeem ourselves and start to regain some glory, I think we won a lot of hearts and following from that on, and I'm forever grateful for that. But yeah, as you probably hear in my underlying tone, that it's not that we have come to the world's end or the pinnacle or the final destination of figuring things out in terms of how you run esports teams, train players, and so forth. So always interested if there's people out there that's listening. Again, those people are tuning in all the way into this 90-minute segment and have certain expertise, certain approach, be it psychology or technology, or you read a book that is very interesting about approaching problems or leadership. I'm more than happy to have those conversations with people. And you reach me on Twitter or email, which is simple, cArn@fnatic.com. At what point, by the way, Duncan, do you rebrand yourself from having a nickname, in my case, cArn, from Carnage, now pushing 40, I'm a family man. What is your thoughts on that? Because you still go by Thorin, right? I like the name.
Yeah, but here's the point. Like, in my opinion, it becomes unique eventually, doesn't it? Like, there's no one else in esports who's cArn, right? So the problem with that is, especially in your case, mate, like, you also come from a boring country. Like, all Swedes have the same fucking names, mate. So the problem is there's a million people called Patrik. Like, there's probably like 10 people in FNATIC right now called Patrik, So, like, I'd stick with cArn. It just makes more sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, very side note.
True.
Anything you want to say from what we have talked about? What sticks out? Like what did kind of validate it, or something makes more sense or less sense? I'm always happy.
I would just say this. Like, here's the thing. You know this. Obviously, you like to talk and you like to unpack your thoughts, etc. So since I knew it was going to be one where it's like I'm not going to get to ask like 50 questions, I tried to just make it. If you notice, like there was a theme, which is more like it was like we went from like who you were as an in-game leader to how you like see teams to how you then as a result pick the next players to come into FNATIC. What does FNATIC represents? I thought there was a pretty good theme overall. We kept it coherent, even though you might have thought you were talking all over the place. Like it's the same with my questions, mate. I just throw a bunch of stuff out there and I see what people pick up on and what they keep going with, and you just kind of keep it a coherent conversation, basically.
Okay, happy to hear that. But what is your own thoughts in terms of what drives performance in esports right now?
Sure. Well, the interesting thing is, I actually think some of the things you were saying there, like as you can probably tell by the way I was asking the question, the sort of things I've sort of slowly come around to over the years. Like I did have like a very extreme perspective on the game before, not just for in-game leaders, but like I was alluding to with players. Like I am the sort of person who sort of did think back in the day, well, like I'll give an extreme example, if someone like Forgiven, who is like amazing at the game, but is a bit of an arsehole as a person, I was of the philosophy of like, right, well, like we'll deal with the personality part separately, like get him in the team, team.
Someone else's problem.
Yeah, and then either me or the coach or whoever has to deal with them, they'll just have to figure it out. But the idea I always thought was like, I thought essentially it was always worth dealing with that. But what I've actually realised over time, essentially, is it's like you say, you want to just like if these were like actual stats, like you were building a Dungeons and Dragons character, right? You'd actually want to just trade off some of the skill for being a better teammate or having more self-awareness about how to use yourself in a team. So like ultimately, like if you have a strong core of those, like I said about your Counter-Strike teams, that is ultimately, I think, a better formula for success, because like we alluded to with the SK Gaming team, mate, it's actually almost a rule in Counter-Strike and team games that an all-star team on paper won't actually win in the game. Like usually the best team in the game isn't even the team that had all the all-stars. It's like you have, I even used to describe the Polish teams from Neo and Tazit. I know they don't like this, but it's just how I describe. I always said I thought they always had just enough skill, like, you know, like, listen, Neo was amazing, but some of the others were just okay players in skill-wise, but all the other qualities they had were amazing. That's why they won all the trophies, you know. It makes sense to me. What do you think?
Yeah, 100%. In some way, it was kind of a mirroring between FNATIC CS 1.6 at that point. Not the 2009 era, I think, because our raw skill was probably greater.
For sure.
Those other values in terms of teammates and experience, perhaps. But yeah, no, I agree with everything you said. But you know, going back to being stubborn as well, right? Like I felt very personally, and I should, responsible for some of the development, or should I say lack of development or repetitiveness of at times poor behaviors from certain players, where it's almost like, well, the risk of confrontation here, or not the risk of, but confrontation comes with a risk of this late season putting us in a bad position from the negotiation, the marketing, and all those things, and trying to, again, like, think about, like, yeah, we are esport team, but we are esport team business first and foremost. And I've also learned and grown in terms of confidence, in terms of just confronting. I think there's very few things out there that I feel like, yeah, I don't really want to speak about. I can hop on the call and speak about anything to anyone at this point, almost, just choosing the right timing and the right tone. But can I choose to go back in time? There are those early moments, and I'm not going to go specific here, but just a proper, like, man-to-man, boy-to-boy conversation with some of the players. Like, but obviously I would be a time traveler, so I can point at what is actually happening, which you don't have the luxury of in reality. But some of the stuff, like being a great teammate, growing up as a person, and being able to, in a better way, because I sometimes I do this kind of conversation at times, maybe less so these days when we have a team management more staffed out. In terms of, like, I've been there in your shoes, and this is the learning I had 5 years later. Only now I realize something that I should have realized back then. And you can choose to trust me. That's up to you. And I'm going to be modest about that. And you see how your life plays out. But I think I have a reasonably, human and half smart approach to these things. But that is kind of one of the regrets, I guess, which I'm now using as like a, I guess, catalyst, just fucking throw myself into the mix when I can, right? To think again, more like, what are the values we're trying? What are we trying to actually build here? And if something is a misfit in that, then there are hundreds of other teams and there are thousands of other players that are willing to take your spot. That doesn't mean that in the short term that's going to be better for any one of us. Maybe even so more worse for us in terms of just short term performance fluctuation. Another thing I want to ask you, right? So finding those, things that are synonymous across the titles or patterns, because again, you can read books about war and that can kind of be applied on business, and that can be applied on sports, in terms of like, just like, how do you motivate, how do you kind of like line manage and structure an organization, whatever it might be. I don't know why I started with war, but I guess you have this kind of art of war thing that some people like to quote. But anyhow, in League of Legends, I could be wrong, I am in the black and orange bubble, which is FNATIC, but historically, maybe less so these days under Yamato and the new management, but it's kind of been this idea that compared to for whatever reason, compared to Counter-Strike, where actually, arguably, in the most successful cases, you have a quite defined in-game leader. At times, maybe also a defined sub-captain or a co-captain, if you may. Maybe that's the Dupree for Glaive. I don't know. Maybe that was the Exist for me, or DSN, more notably. But in League of Legends, it seems like this kind of in-game leadership element has landed at the place which suggests that the person, the individual player, due to the draft you had, which kind of makes sense, I guess, because you have so many nuances and circumstances, but the one that kind of get a good start and can, with the good start, see what's needed to boost that forward and your scale, right? I'm just talking about like leveraging from being ahead. Okay. That individual should call the shots. I am not sure. I'm not convinced. I said that for the third time now. Because if you apply that, because that's something I like to do these days way more than past. You're looking at also like the real world of business or real world of sports, and you maybe use that, you're finding those kind of analogies or comparisons. So think about it from a football standpoint, where obviously you can barely hear each other, right? When it's back from normal, like in a stadium, you have to almost like doing this sure. to hear each other. But let's just say typically there's a central midfielder like a Xavi, if I pronounce it correctly, that maybe leads and strategically. I'm just using it as example.
Yeah, of course.
But then you say, Zlatan Ibrahimovic, and I would probably get a few Swedes against me now, or a few Zlatan fans against me. But let's say he has an amazing game. He gets the dribbles, he does the first goal in the first half, just smiles, like celebrates the fans. And because of that, he should suddenly be the leader and call out the remaining of the strategy. Maybe the worst example ever, I'm not really sure, but what happens if you employ a bit more of a, maybe what we had with Yellow Star, but maybe the people that really knows what went down in the actual practice and the actual games, because I cannot always listen in, right? Maybe that was different, but maybe China and Korea way more than I, but what happens if you have a very designated in-game leader in the game of League of Legends? Because I think you have this in Dota. Like, speak about repetitive success.
That's so crazy, dude.
Puppy. Looking at Puppy, basically. Like, he's been world-class the last 13 years, over 2 iterations, and how many metas? 50 different metas.
A lot.
Yeah. So basically, I don't get it.
Oh no, but what's funny is what you're getting to now, cArn, is actually something that I believe it's very slow and gradual, but it's actually the epiphany that League of Legends, the professional community, is realizing right now. Like, I'll give you an example. Only a few weeks ago in Korea, in the LCK, which used to be the best league in the world, but obviously like the LPL in China's sort of overtaken it. Because they've been overtaken, one of the things they're still doing is like they're sort of all scrambling, trying to figure out how to be the best again, because they have that perception. I mean, the Swedes know this in Counter-Strike. They think we should be the best. Of course, if we aren't, something's going wrong. So one of the things that they even said, no joke, was that some of the teams are actively looking to see if there are any veteran players that retired who actually want to come out of retirement. And I think it's for this reason you're talking about. Basically, in League of Legends, early on in the game, you maybe didn't need like Counter-Strike level like shot calling, as it were. You needed like very simple things like go in now, or like basically you just need to agree, like let's all team fight now, basically, or I'm the one person who's on the sideline, like I'm just going to tell you what I'm doing, basically. I'm going to come back, or I'm going to keep going. Some very simple communication. It's also why you could have all these multinational rosters, in my opinion. The difference is this. You're right. In Dota, this has always been understood. Like, actually, the crazy thing about Dota 2 is, even though it's a game with a lot of skill, like you have all these motherfuckers like Arteezy that are insanely skilled, the actual biggest winners in the game, you're right, it's all the captains. It's all the people who play the raw support role. And as you say, they've just played, like, the point is they really are just playing with their brain at this point in time. They're just like 10 years in on, like, I know everything about how to win, basically. And their perception, by the way, for real, is like, I'll just go and get someone out of the equivalent of solo queue, basically. Like, that's where people like Arteezy essentially were taken. They would just take it off, like, right, he has skills, and I'm the guy who's going to sort of pilot him. The problem in League, as far as I can tell, is this. Because at the initial period, you didn't need, like, the pure shot caller, I sort of agree and I disagree with them. Like, on the one hand, right, the premise you're talking about, the idea, like, whoever gets the lead in the game should be the shot caller, right? In a very minor sense, I think there's a logic to that, but it goes like this. In my opinion, if you have, in the case of having a lead, what you really mean is I've got resources that I could do something with right now in the game, right? I think if that player, they probably should have, like, I would just find it as like a responsibility to communicate more, just in as much as, like, they themselves must have an idea of what they can do that maybe the teammate doesn't. But I agree, like, in my opinion, it should only be within their little worldview. Like, unless they literally are going to do some, like, map-wide movement that everyone needs to participate in, they're only going to be doing a small amount of it. The problem is this, as far as I can tell. A bit like in Counter-Strike, you have really, really great in-game leaders. You have people that we'd love to get on a show like this at Carrigan, fucking Glaive, and sit down. You could talk for hours with these guys about how much you obviously back at 1.6. The problem is this, in my opinion, once you get past the really great people, you get a bunch of people who are like, they're pretty good, and then after that, the drop-off is crazy, in my opinion. So in my opinion, just like in CSGO, we could do the same as Dota, dude. If I pick out the greatest, like, 10 in-game leaders, they're going to basically be all the most successful players ever, like, in terms of their teams, right? Yes. In League, I actually think that what happened was people went too far towards the idea that, like, you don't need those players. They basically did, they had the reverse epiphany to me, mate. It feels like in League, they do all just go for the mechanical player. In fact, now they even want the rookie over the veteran. Like, they'll take some guy out of solo queue over, like, Soaz, like some player who's, like, insane, like, track record, always coming back to the top, incredible experience. Like, again, another guy where he could write the book on how to play his role, you know, but they'd rather get the guy now who's just like, you know, today he's super sick in solo queue, right? Yeah. So I actually think personally in League, they've gone to, what they've understood incorrectly is you don't want like one dedicated shot caller if he's just an average in-game leader. If he's the equivalent of like some random guy from 1.6 that we don't even remember, like, you know, the 6th best Swedish teams in-game leader. The problem is, if you have, like you say, Yellow Star, you actually do want him to do most of the talking. Because in that scenario, almost everything he says is going to be really intelligent, intuitive, like he's going to understand his teammate, you know, he's going to have it all. Like, basically, it's one of the areas I kind of disagree with some pros on. I do think, actually, if you have a genius guy like that, you should give him most of the power. They should basically be like a CS 1.6 in-game leader. Now, here's the other thing that people don't get, though, dude, is they also think when we give these examples that, like, in 1.6, you're the only one talking. Of course you're not. Like, other people, as you said, they can be a secondary leader. In fact, even then, I'm sure if Get Right or someone had said, like, an idea, like, actually, I'd prefer to do that, I'm sure you listen. You take the suggestion on board, right?
But the words per minute is probably greater in FPS than a MOBA, depending on the... Yeah, must be, yeah. Anyway, let's see what the future holds and what Koreans maybe starts now, then that becomes a trend.
Yeah, there we go. Right, tack så mycket.
Tack själv. Bye-bye.
This video was kindly supported by Kris with a K, Lager15, Matt Pugnatio Ragkula, Shenlong, Travis Goff, Wisetown, Zachary Carter, Zach Smid, Adam Oaks, Alexander Rao, Animosity, Butt Pounder 420, Kris, Eric Hillestad, Hades, J Dobbs, Jensen Gore, John Shelton, Joseph Ginsberg, Kovacevic, Tobias Bernasconi, Zumba, Zyrathenia, and a special thanks goes out to both Jerky's Minion and Joshua Gardner. Would you like to suggest a topic or a guest for my content? Maybe you want to ask one of those questions for my video AMA. Do you want teasers? Find out who the guests are for my upcoming shows. Maybe you even want to be a nerd having a long 2 or 3 hour discussion with me about anything on one of those video discussions. Well, if so, put your money where your mouth is. Join the Skrilluminati today via the Patreon link in the description box below.